Good morning. Welcome to Inquisition Update. My name's Tom Fress, and I'll be your host for the next hour. You're listening to FirstAmendmentRadio.net. Thanks for tuning in, everybody. And I'm sure you're anxious, as am I, to return to our reading and discussion of the book Footprints of the Jesuits by R.W. Thompson. We're seeing the example of Germany, which, after the Protestant Reformation, had become thoroughly Protestant. Peace prevailed. The government now served the people. It was out from under the yoke of Rome. The gospel was being heard for the first time in Germany. All was at peace. And then the papacy decided to restore his iron yoke upon the people of Germany, to overthrow the Protestant Reformation, to reassert papal authority through a change of government, to put back in place a papal monarch, and to subject the people once again to papal tyranny. And in the process of doing that, the papacy recruited the militia of the Pope, the Jesuit order. The Jesuits, the Counter-Reformation, began a multifaceted war against Protestantism in Germany. And one of their facets of war was to institute a university in Rome for Germans. German children to be sent to Rome to be indoctrinated into the ways of monarchical life. That to be taught that the Protestant Reformation and the form of government that sprang forth from the Protestant Reformation in Germany had to be overthrown. And then once educated with these Jesuit tenets, these counter-Reformation tenets, to be sent back to Germany to educate the rest of the children. It's an attempt of the Jesuits to counteract the Reformation. Now, that was one instance, and another instance was to send Jesuits to Germany to befriend all the monarchical powers that it previously existed, and to convince them that if the Protestant Reformation was not stopped, there would be no hope for a return of monarchical government, and that they would forever lose their influence in Germany. So they worked in concert with the Jesuits to undermine and overthrow the Protestant Reformation and the Protestant government in place in Germany. Now, beginning in the first full paragraph on page 122, the author says, "But the institution of a Jesuit college at Rome was not the only means employed, inasmuch as more immediate and active measures were considered necessary. Therefore, whilst that was left to bear its fruit at a later period, the Jesuits sent into Germany some of their prudent and sagacious members, such as they supposed would likely to exercise influence over the princes, so that through them the whole German population might be reached. These princes were the acknowledged representatives of monarchism, and it was believed that if they could be persuaded to accept the Jesuit emissaries as their allies, the usual methods of papal compulsion could be employed with impunity. In this, the Jesuits calculated sagaciously, and were enabled to establish several colleges in Germany." Here again, we see Jesuit universities, Jesuit colleges being erected. This is their mode of operation. This is part of their plan of war, education. And it says, in this, the Jesuits calculated sagaciously and were enabled to establish several colleges in Germany, and ultimately to begin an open and direct war upon Protestantism. They did not invoke the aid of reason. They neither invited nor allowed calm discussion with learned Protestant theologians, but relied entirely upon the united authority of the Pope and the princes. Okay, this is a union of church and state. And it says that is upon the monarchical power. Okay, not only is church and state united, but it's monarchical in character. Away goes representative government. It's the Pope who dictates over the kings of the earth. King of kings and Lord of lords, a counterfeit Christ. Okay? Don't look in the future for Antichrist. He's been with us all the time. It's the papacy, and this is how he operates. Now, finding the Lutherans and the Calvinists, Protestants, divided upon theological questions, and we're well aware of those theological differences even today among Protestants. It says, speaking of the Jesuits, finding the Lutherans and the Calvinists divided upon theological questions, they availed themselves of every opportunity to incite them to mutual strife. Now, if you're familiar with the Jesuit oath, this is a part of the oath that a Jesuit swears, to sow discord among the Protestant sects. Okay, this is in full complicity with the Jesuit oath. Now, many people have accused me saying that the Jesuit oath that you talk about, that you read on amateur radio, that you read on Inquisition Update, is a fabrication. And I simply argue, fabricated or not, it's the oath that the Jesuits keep. And all you have to do is view their activities throughout history, and you can formulate their oath. So their accusations of the falsity of the oath, it just falls flat on its face. All you have to do is observe the operations and the activities of the Jesuits throughout the world, and you can tell that they hold precisely to that oath. It is not a fiction. It is the oath of the Jesuits. And for those who don't know what I'm talking about, please read The Extreme Oath of the Jesuits. Just Google the phrase, The Extreme Oath of the Jesuits, and read it for yourself. They are to incite discord among parties previously at peace and to incite them to war. And this is a strategy that has constantly been used by the Jesuits among Protestant denominations, to divide and to conquer. And while pointing out the division, the doctrinal division between Protestant denominations, the Jesuits boastingly tout the unity of the Roman Catholic faith as a clear indication that the Roman Catholic Church is the Church of Jesus Christ and the Protestant Reformation is heresy. Okay? Now listen, R.W. Thompson's going to explain this, and it is to my satisfaction that the divisions between Protestants are a natural occurrence of honest religious difference and not a sign of their sanction by Christ. And the unity that is held in the Roman Catholic Church is by coercion. Okay? This is the difference between free religious thought, freedom of religion, and coercion by the Roman Catholic Church. He says again, finding the Lutherans and the Calvinists divided upon theological questions, they, the Jesuits, availed themselves of every opportunity to incite them to mutual strife, insisting, as they have ever since continued to do, that there can be but one true form of Christian faith, which every human being is obliged to accept or to offend God. Now that being the Roman Catholic Church. Now, seemingly insensible to the fact that the Creator, listen to this, this is the explanation that R.W. Thompson gives. It's incomplete, but it's satisfactory. Listen to what he says. Seemingly insensible to the fact that the Creator has made the minds of men to differ as their faces and features. They were sagacious enough to know that differences of opinion upon religious as upon all other subjects could be prevented only by force and coercion. It says, therefore, to compel uniformity of faith and to uproot Protestantism, they persuaded some of the princes, especially those of Bavaria, to believe that the principle of monarchy was endangered and would be entirely destroyed if the influences of the Reformation were not obliterated. That such was, and yet is, the natural effect of these influences is true. And therefore, as these princes could easily see that if popular institutions were established in Germany, their princely occupations would be threatened, they became the willing tools of the Jesuits. Okay? So the Jesuits convinced the princes that if Protestantism continued, their princely occupations would be threatened. Monarchism would be completely and forever overthrown. They had a duty to themselves and to the papacy, the vicar of Christ on earth, to overthrow the Protestant Reformation and to unite church and state as it was in the old world order before the Protestant Reformation. Now, the Duke of Bavaria was one of the most submissive, and he was the most willing to be a persecutor. He had been educated by the Jesuits, and consequently was soon induced to exhibit, quote, the utmost earnestness, unquote, in adopting measures for destroying all the influences of the Protestant Reformation and putting an end to Protestantism. He was resolved, says Niccolini, the historian, quote, not to leave a vestige of those new doctrines which for the last 40 years had been spreading so fast in his kingdom, unquote. That is, Protestantism, Protestant doctrine, not to leave one vestige of the Protestant doctrine in his country. And it says, neither he nor the Jesuits made the least disguise of the fact that all their efforts were directed to the single object of preventing the freedom of religious belief. Okay? Whenever the Jesuits get control, out goes freedom of religion. One of the basic tenets of the Constitution of the United States, the Bill of Rights, the First Amendment to the Constitution. Religious liberty. That's Protestantism. Okay? So the Jesuits are going to attack our religious liberty. And if they can't do it in the churches, they will do it from Washington, D.C., and I assert they're doing it from both the churches and Washington, D.C. He says his first step to this end was to require that the profession of faith prescribed by the Council of Trent, that is, Roman Catholicism, should be subscribed and adhered to. That is, that Protestants should renounce the religion which their consciences approved and accept that which their consciences did not approve. In other words, to renounce Protestantism and rejoin the whore of Rome. Now it says that the people might be brought into obedience and forced to this, quote, he sent throughout all the provinces swarms of Jesuits, accompanied by bands of troops whose bayonets came to the aid of the preachers when their eloquence was unsuccessful in converting the heretics, unquote. That is, the Protestants. So the Jesuits came flooding in. They were assisted with military. I wonder who were paying the wages of the bayonets that followed the Jesuits around. Well, the same people that always pay the bills. The people. So they were taking the resources of the people, paying government-funded militia, carrying bayonets to support the Jesuits in the forcible conversion of Protestants to Roman Catholicism. And that's exactly what's going to happen in this country. Your tax dollars are going to be used to pay government-paid militia, that is our military, to aid the Jesuits in forcibly converting you to Roman Catholicism. You'll be forced to renounce your Protestantism, your Protestant beliefs and pay allegiance to the new world order. Now it says, those who remained unsubdued were expelled from their estates. Okay? You're going to be kicked out of your house. You're going to be kicked off your land. You're going to be made a fugitive in your own country. You're going to be stripped of all your assets. And it says further, prohibited books were seized and burned. Okay? My library that I'm looking at right here, some 400 books, they're going to be confiscated and burned. I won't even be able to give them to somebody. And it says, and above all, says Ranke, quote, the Jesuit institutions were promoted, for by their agency it was that the youth of Bavaria were to be educated in the spirit of strict orthodoxy, which then meant what with the Jesuits it still means, opposition to religious freedom. So they're going to denounce free thought. They're going to denounce Protestantism. We're going to have to conform to a global mindset, and they're being educated to conform to that global mindset in the schools as we speak, both in the churches and in the public school system. And this New World Order is a done deal. It's already in effect right before our very eyes. R.W. Thompson is seeing what is happening in the United States based on the example given throughout history, repeated example after example after example of the Jesuits doing these very things in other countries. And it's ridiculous that the people of the United States don't see this coming. It's only because the Jesuits have had control of education. And they have stripped this knowledge from the curriculum of our schools and from our churches. This book that I'm reading right here on Inquisition Update should be read in the Protestant churches. It should be read in the Sunday school classes of all the Protestant churches. If they won't read them, if they won't allow them to be read in the public school system, then it is the spiritual responsibility of the Protestant churches to educate the children, to be wary of Jesuit influence both in the churches and in the government. And this is where our churches have failed us. And it says, for a time, the Jesuits were restrained in Austria by Ferdinand I and Maximilian. But during the reign of Rudolph II, they became bolder and more exacting. The Jesuit provincial obtained great influence over Rudolph and was urgent in his demands that he should extirpate heresy from his dominions. At last he succeeded in inducing Rudolph to inaugurate a general persecution of the Lutherans, and, quote, the greatest atrocity and utmost rigor were displayed in destroying every trace of Protestantism, unquote. The work of extirpation began in the cities. That's where we're going to see it in this country, the cities. And it says, quote, the Reformed clergy were removed, that is, the Protestant clergy were removed, and their places were filled by Roman Catholics, by Roman Catholic priests, unquote. A religious formula was prescribed. Okay, no more Protestant form of religion, no more Protestant form of service in the churches. You're going to be introduced to a liturgy, okay, Roman Catholic form of worship. It says a religious formula was prescribed by the Jesuits, obviously, which required universal assent to the doctrine, quote, that everything is true which the Roman Catholic Church says is true and has laid down as a rule of life and doctrine, and that the Pope is the head of the one apostolic church. In other words, if you don't have the Pope as its head, it's not an apostolic church, it's not a church at all. And you're not Christians, you're separated brethren. Okay? you got to come back home to Rome. You have to share a common communion with Rome. You have to accept the Pope as the head of your spiritual head and your temporal head. That's what they did in Germany. That's what they're going to do in the United States. That's what they are doing in the United States of America today. The Protestants, listen to this. Do you have a job in government, you Protestants out there? The Protestants were expelled from all offices of state. No more Protestant politicians. No more Protestant civil servants. Anybody paid by government salary, if you're Protestant, you're in the unemployment line. Papists alone could be burghers. In other words, nobody in government but a papist. Doctor's degrees in the universities were conferred only upon those who subscribed to the Roman Catholic faith. Okay? If you're going to the university and you spent $150,000, $200,000 for education to become a psychologist or psychiatrist or a doctor or a lawyer, you wasted all your money because you're not going to get your license to practice. It says the Jesuit schools were governed by regulations, quote, which prescribed Catholic formularies, fasts, worship, according to the Catholic ritual, unquote, unquote, and all the pupils were taught the Jesuit catechism. Okay? That's what we're going to be taught. We're going to have to become Catholic. We're going to have to mirror the Catholic formula of worship, participate in Roman Catholic fasts, and according to the Roman Catholic ritual. That's why today in some of the ecumenical evangelical belly churches, they're calling the bread of communion, they're calling it the Eucharist now. Is your church calling it the Eucharist? That's just one step. After that, they'll start teaching transubstantiation, that the Eucharist is literally the blood, body, soul, and divinity of Christ, the whole Christ, nothing lacking. It is Jesus Christ in the form of bread, and you must worship it, and you must also sacrifice it every Sunday on the altar of your church. That's Roman Catholicism. And it says all the pupils were taught the Jesuit catechism. Okay? The instruction in the churches will be organized by the Jesuits. And that's precisely what's going on today. All Protestant books were seized and taken away from the booksellers' shops. No freedom of the press anymore. And all that were found in the custom houses were confiscated. Protestant literature is going to be destroyed. It's got to be considered subversive of the new state, the new Roman Catholic state. And it says the historian, summing it up, said, quote, all through Germany the same proceedings were resorted to, and everywhere we find the Jesuits foremost in the reaction. There was no bishop, no prince, who went to visit a province upon religious concerns who did not bring with him a troop of Jesuits who on his departure were often left there and with almost unlimited powers, unquote. That's the New World Order, coming to a neighborhood near you. We'll be right back after this.
In this day of economic uncertainty and soaring unemployment, safe investments are often hard to find. But investing in the precious metals is the safest investment of all, because gold and silver is real money. Government-printed currency is not. Call Melody Cedarstrom at Discount Gold and Silver Trading Company at 1-800-375-4188. Melody has been helping people secure their financial future for over 10 years. While others in the business claim honesty, Melody will deliver. Give her a call, 1-800-375-4188. That's 800-375-4188.
Visit crosstheborder.org crosstheborder.org, to get your print, EPUB, or PDF version of the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. That's crosstheborder.org.
I know you all want answers, and believe me, so do I, and I'll do my best to get them.
Despite Nicolas Cage's promise to do his best to get Left Behind rapture answers for us, don't hold your breath. Not everyone believes Left Behind is true prophecy. Some may even regard as conspiratorial the mainstream re-release of the Left Behind movie with actor Nicolas Cage portraying the main character as an attempt to further reinforce in the minds of all this perception of false prophecy, in order to condition the masses for the play about to begin. If you want true Bible prophecy answers, get the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. The author exposes the Latin rapture origin, the 7-year tribulation deception, true Bible revelation of Daniel's 70 weeks, the abomination of desolation, the restrainer, America in the Revelation, the image of the beast and the mark of the beast, and the truth about God's chosen people, and so much more about Bible prophecy. This book will shatter the Left Behind paradigm of future events. Get the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. Visit crosstheborder.org, crosstheborder.org, to get your print, EPUB, or PDF version of the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. That's crosstheborder.org.
Welcome back to Inquisition Update. You're listening to FirstAmendmentRadio.com. The quote before the break was, "All through Germany, the same proceedings were resorted to, and everywhere we find the Jesuits, the Counter-Reformation, foremost in the reaction. There was no bishop, no prince, who went to visit a province upon religious concerns who did not bring with him a troop of Jesuits, who on his departure were often left there with almost unlimited powers." Unquote. And as you might remember, these Jesuits will be accompanied by taxpayer-funded bayonets. This is government coercion, government establishment of religion. That's what it took to overthrow the Protestant Reformation in Germany. Government-sponsored religious persecution. The union of church and state. The union of church and state against Christ and his people. Now, the task of becoming familiar with the history of those times is formidable, but its performance will amply repay the careful and thoughtful student, inasmuch as the events which then transpired materially influenced the subsequent condition of the world. Global consequences. Global consequences. Again, it says the task of becoming familiar with the history of those times is formidable. We here at Inquisition Update are up to that task. As formidable as it is, we're taking that task here at Inquisition Update to become familiar with the history of those times, the old world order, so that we might better be prepared to meet and to face and to oppose this new world order. The task of becoming familiar with the history of those times is formidable, but its performance will amply repay the careful and thoughtful student. Are you careful and thoughtful? Are you paying attention here at Inquisition Update? Inasmuch as the events which then transpired materially influenced the subsequent condition of the world. Do you want to affect the subsequent condition of the world? Tune in to Inquisition Update. Become familiar with this history and be prepared to oppose the repetition of history. And it says, especially did they influence that current of affairs which caused the most enlightened nations. Who were the most enlightened nations? The Protestant nations, of course. Caused the most enlightened nations to drift toward religious freedom and popular government, the two great and inseparable factors in modern progress. Okay? Modern progress. The term modern is directly linked to the Protestant Reformation. Progress. The progress of nations has transpired beginning with the Protestant Reformation. Prior to that, it was the Dark Ages. Ignorance and superstition and papal tyranny controlled the world, the then known world, Europe. All the advantages that we have today are as a result of the Protestant Reformation. Your right to criticize the government, the king, and the pope, church and state, is a Protestant liberty, which Rome would desperately love to strip from you and to throw you back into darkness, ignorance, superstition, and tyranny. To change the world into a two-class system. The ruling elite that served the papacy, the priests and the monarchs, and then the people serving the papacy and the rich ruling elite, the priests and the monarchs. Two-class system. It says, at the period here referred to, true Christian civilization, as inspired by the charity and gentleness exhibited in the life of Christ, seemed to hang for a time at equipoise in balance. The struggle for mastery between the light of the Reformation and the darkness of the Middle Ages was long and fierce, and occasionally doubtful. One cannot fail to see that the spirit of liberty had been so nearly crushed out by the monarchism of the church and state that it required the finger of providence, capital P, to point out the way to the revival of primitive Christianity. See, even R.W. Thompson equates primitive Christianity, apostolic Christianity, with the Protestant Reformation. It's not a new religion. It's the oldest Christian religion. It's even older than the Roman Catholic Church. True apostolic Christianity. That's what Protestantism is. He says, one cannot fail to see that the spirit of liberty had been so nearly crushed out by the monarchism of church and state, the union of church and state, that it required the finger of God to point out the way to the revival of primitive Christianity, Protestantism, and the restoration of its beneficial influences upon the consciences and the lives of the vast multitudes who had been long held in inferiority. God's people in the old world order were always held in inferiority, and not only that, but they were persecuted unto annihilation. He said, all who live godly in Christ Jesus shall suffer persecution. You want to know those who lived godly in Christ Jesus? Look at Fox's Book of Martyrs. Those who were persecuted. And who were they persecuted by? The anti-church, the Antichrist church, the Church of Rome. Now it says the student will find the conflict instructive at every point. It will bring into view perfidy and treachery where there ought to have been confidence and fair dealing, shameful betrayals of the cause of truth and justice, and the heartless sacrifice of many thousands of inoffensive people. It'll show popes and kings uniting their power in the cause of oppression and wrong, and shamelessly practicing vices condemned equally by the laws of God and man. That's what you see in the Roman Catholic Church today. The Roman Catholic priesthood are corrupt to the core. The global pedophile priest pandemic is simply God's way of showing us one more time not to have anything to do with the Church of Antichrist. It's always been the case of the Roman Catholic Church. Whenever she gains power, she becomes untouchable by the people, by the governments, or by God, and the corruption runs rampant. Incest, murder, simony, sodomy, you name it, it comes front and center every time the Roman Catholic Church gets power in a country. The priesthood become drunk with their own wine. And the filth that pours out of that cup is an abomination to every thinking man and woman and child on the planet. They commit vices and sins that are against every law, divine and human. That's the anti-church. The expose of the historic sodomite and pedophile history of the papacy and the Roman Catholic hierarchy is simply God's way, a most effective way to tell God's people they ought not to have anything to do with Rome. He says many figures conspicuous in history will appear, among them that of the great Emperor Charles V. Okay? We're still talking about this formidable task of becoming familiar with the history of the times of the old world order. He said many figures conspicuous in history will appear, among them that of the great Emperor Charles V. He will be seen procuring imperial dominion over a people he didn't even know and whose language he could neither speak nor understand. Quarreling with the Pope one day and threatening to subvert his throne, and becoming reconciled the next, in order that monarchism should be strengthened. Sending savage hordes of armed men to crush out the spirit of religious liberty in his native Netherlands by blood and murder. Promising protection to the German Protestants in order to obtain their assistance in his war against the Turks, and then afterwards betraying and persecuting the Protestants for heresy. Uniting for a time with the Pope against the King of France, and then with the King of France against the Pope. Forcing the Pope to convene a general council, and pretending to grant by his infamous interim some shadowy rights to Protestants, in order that they might ultimately be compelled to accept the faith as the council should decree. That is Roman Catholicism. And at last, when his successes were turned into adversities and his tortuous policy involved him in disappointment, abdicating his royal authority, retiring to a Roman Catholic monastery, and then confiding the infamous work of persecuting Protestants and desolating his native land to his cold-blooded and murderous son. That was Charles V. That's just part of the history that defines the old world order. Charles V. And it says then, as the scene shifts, as we continue to study this history, it says then as the scene shifts, Philip II will appear with his vicegerent, the Duke of Alva, and his bloodthirsty crew, the sound of whose warlike bugles were drowned by the piercing cries of their Protestant victims. More persecution of those who live godly in Christ Jesus by the persecutor, Rome and her kings. It says, then may also be seen, passing in panoramic view, the whole land of the Netherlands, drenched in the blood of innocent and persecuted Protestants. When were you ever told that Protestants were persecuted in the Netherlands. See what difference it makes when the Jesuits control education. I was never told in the schools that Protestants in the Netherlands were persecuted by the Jesuits and by the Roman Catholic Church. I was never taught that in my history class in school. He said, then may be seen passing in panoramic view the whole land of the Netherlands, drenched in the blood of innocent and persecuted Protestants. It happened in the Netherlands. You think it might happen here in the United States? You saw it happen in Germany. You saw it happen in France and Spain. Who's to say? Who's to say that it can't happen right here in Protestant America? He says the Spanish and Italian Inquisitions carry on their horrible work with so much activity that its machinery was never still. France, trembling under the threshold of ruin, and her kings and queens forming leagues with the Huguenots to be immediately and perfidiously violated. Yes, they make temporary alliances with the Protestants, like Vatican Council II and ecumenism. You can consider it the same strategy that the Jesuits used against the French Protestants, the Calvinists of France, the Huguenots. Temporary allegiances only to be betrayed in the end and slaughtered like pigs. And Germany, torn into factions by the discord between princes and people, which was born of Jesuit intrigue, offering a tempting field to the emissaries of the papacy, wherein usurped and illegitimate authority might revel, whilst the sacred militia of Ignatius Loyola, the Jesuit order, rejoiced at the triumph they had won over Protestantism and free religious thought. History's going to repeat itself right here in the United States of America because we have been blinded by the church and by the state what the Jesuit area of operations, what their world globalist goals are, and that it all will come at the cost of Protestantism. Apostolic Christianity. All those who live godly in Christ Jesus will suffer persecution right here in the United States of America. And they will suffer that persecution at the hand of the Antichrist, the biblical, historical, and prophetic Antichrist, the papacy, and her Jesuit-led counter-reformation. There's light and there's darkness. And for the darkness to overcome the light, it must use bloody, ruthless force. So all you have to do is look through history to see who it was that used the bloody, ruthless force. And just know that the blood that they shed was just like the blood that Jesus shed on the cross. Innocent. Through all these courses of events, the Jesuits steadily appeared, alike indifferent to the wounds they inflicted upon the church and the agonies of their unnumbered victims. As confessors and confidants of kings, their exertions to enshroud the world in a pall of monarchism was ceaseless and untiring. They climbed into every office of state and molded the temporal policy of popes and kings. They moved sovereigns from right to left, forward and backward, as children amuse themselves with toys. They exchanged the humble worship of the altar for the glittering of courts, as if Christ in his life had set the example of ambitious display. They enrolled sovereigns and princes in the ranks of their defenders, and by their help drove Protestant preachers from their pulpits, Protestant professors and teachers from their colleges and schools, and Protestant people into the deepest depths of humiliation by such measures of compulsion and repression as it must have required the attentive faculties of fiends to discover. it would have required the inventive faculties of fiends to discover. All these things transpired in Europe during the terrible conflict between Protestantism and reaction. Between Protestantism and papal reaction. Between Protestantism and Jesuit reaction. But in no other portion of the continental states was the difference between the opposing forces more distinctly marked than in Germany after the Jesuits, by means of their control of education, became enabled to check the progress of popular enlightenment and force the nation back again into the old grooves of ignorance and superstition. You want to know how the Jesuits are going to destroy this country? Through education. For what purpose? To take us out of the light and put us back into the darkness of the Middle Ages. And they call that the New World Order. From the first entry of the Jesuits into Germany, the peace of the country was seriously disturbed. We've seen how thoroughly reconciled to each other were those of all shades of religious faith. Members of the Church of Rome and Protestants were in perfect accord upon all matters involving the welfare of Germany, neither concerning themselves about the religious opinions of the other. In this respect, it was as it should have been, and ought yet to be throughout the Christian world. And the happiness and progressive prosperity of Germany was assured by it, until the spoiler came in the form of Jesuitism, not as the bearer of messages of peace and goodwill from Rome. You know, Rome just loves to use that term, goodwill. All people of goodwill must come to the aid of the Pope. It says, and the happiness and progressive prosperity of Germany was assured by it, until the spoiler came in the form of Jesuitism, not as the bearer of messages of peace and goodwill from Rome, but the vast progeny of evils which in the age of fable were supposed to have escaped when Pandora's jar was broken. They let these loose upon the land without shame or remorse until society was convulsed from center to circumference. Peaceful homes were desolated, hearts that had rejoiced were broken, all under the irreverent pretense that it was for the, quote, greater glory of God, unquote. Ad majorem Dei gloriam, the motto of the Jesuit order, all for the glory of God. They can bring hell upon earth as long as it glorifies their little God in Rome. And that's what they've done all throughout history. For 500 years. And does anyone dare to suggest that they have changed? After 500 years? After what they're doing, even in the United States today as we speak, a mirror image of what they did in Germany. And soon to take on the same characteristics that they expended in France at the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre. He says, let it not be forgotten that Germany was indebted to Protestantism for her condition of peace and prosperity. Germany was indebted to Protestantism for her condition of peace and prosperity. We have seen that the demoralized condition of the Roman Catholic clergy was employed by Loyola as justification that of papal approval for his society. And the learned Jesuit historian Abby Maynard is forced to admit that when Luther gave the first impulse of the Reformation, quote, the clergy, the Roman Catholic clergy of Germany offered a sad example of corrupted faith and relaxed morals, unquote. The same condition exists today. While Protestantism is being overthrown in the United States of America, where the light of this country is being shut out by the darkness, At the same time, we're being informed about global priest corruption. The Vatican Bank. We have stories of the new Pope Francis I, a Jesuit himself, the first in world history to become the Pope, is a war criminal from Argentina, supporting a rebel government, trying to overthrow the government of Argentina. Well, that's what Jesuits do. And now we've got one sitting in the so-called chair of Peter, the one to whom all the kings of the earth bow, wearing black and veils to cover their shame and kissing his ring. Even the President of the United States, who should have no loyalty to anybody on this earth but the people of this country. He now must go to Rome and kiss the hand of a Jesuit priest under the complete direction of the Jesuit general, whose sworn purpose is to overthrow Protestantism wherever it exists and replace it with Roman tyranny. History's repeating itself. He says the clergy of Germany offered a sad example of corrupted faith and relaxed morals. He calls it a mournful period. Notwithstanding, for 1,000 years, these and other evils have been growing and spreading under the patronage of Rome. The papacy then dictated the Christianity of Germany. Mark the difference when Luther, Melanchthon, Bucer, and Karlstadt announced the necessity of reform and put the ball of the Protestant Reformation in motion. The great Ranke, whose impartiality has extorted even Jesuit praise when referring to the effect produced by the Reformation in Germany, who says, quote, "In short, from west to east and from north to south throughout all Germany, Protestantism had unquestioningly the preponderance. The nobility were attached to it from the very first. The body of public functionaries, already in those days numerous and important, was trained up in the new doctrine." I see we've run out of time. We'll be back tomorrow to continue. You've been listening to Inquisition Update.
Visit crosstheborder.org, CROSS, crosstheborder.org, to get your print, EPUB, or PDF version of the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. That's crosstheborder.org.
I know you all want answers, and believe me, so do I, and I'll do my best to get them.
Despite Nicolas Cage's promise to do his best to get left behind rapture answers for us, don't hold your breath. Not everyone believes Left Behind is true prophecy. Some may even regard as conspiratorial the mainstream re-release of the Left Behind movie, with actor Nicolas Cage portraying the main character, as an attempt to further reinforce in the minds of all this perception of false prophecy, in order to condition the masses for the play about to begin. If you want true Bible prophecy answers, get the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. The author exposes the Latin rapture origin, the 7-year tribulation deception, true Bible revelation of Daniel's 70 weeks, the abomination of desolation, the restrainer, America in the Revelation, the image of the beast and the mark of the beast, and the truth about God's chosen people, and so much more about Bible prophecy. This book will shatter the Left Behind paradigm of future events. Get the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. Visit crosstheborder.org, CROSS, crosstheborder.org, to get your print, EPUB, or PDF version of the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. That's crosstheborder.org.